Hello, my sleepy friends. If you could quietly step back into an ordinary medieval village at sunrise, the first thing you would notice would not be the castles, or the knights, or the dramatic stories that history books often describe. Instead, you would notice something much simpler and far more constant: pain. Not the sudden dramatic pain of battle or injury, but the slow, everyday pain that people simply accepted as a normal part of living. In the medieval world, discomfort and physical suffering were woven so deeply into daily life that most people rarely stopped to think about it. What modern society might treat as a serious medical problem was often just another ordinary morning in the Middle Ages. Consider the simple act of waking up. A medieval farmer rising before dawn after sleeping on a wooden bench or a straw mattress would already feel the weight of yesterday's labor in his body. His shoulders might ache from swinging an axe or carrying bundles of firewood. His back might throb from hours spent bending over fields or hauling sacks of grain. There were no soft orthopedic beds, no heating systems keeping the night air warm, and no painkillers waiting in a bathroom cabinet. Instead, the stiffness and soreness of the body were simply part of greeting the new day. For many people, the first real pain of the morning began even before work started. Dental pain was incredibly common in medieval life. Teeth often decayed quickly because diets contained coarse grains, hard bread, and sometimes stones from poorly ground flour. Sugar was rare, but tooth damage still occurred because oral hygiene barely existed in the way we understand it today. Many people lost teeth early in life, and infections in the gums could cause constant throbbing pain that lasted for weeks or months. Yet most individuals simply lived with it, chewing carefully on one side of the mouth or avoiding certain foods while continuing their daily work. As the day began and people stepped outside into the cold morning air, another form of pain quickly appeared: the harsh physical strain of labor. Medieval work was relentless and deeply physical. Farmers spent long hours plowing heavy soil with wooden tools, cutting crops with handheld sickles, and carrying loads that strained muscles and joints. Craftsmen in villages hammered metal, carved wood, or spun thread for hours at a time, using repetitive movements that slowly wore down their bodies. Without modern medicine or ergonomic tools, the human body absorbed all of this strain directly. By the age of 30 or 40, many laborers already suffered from aching joints, worn knees, and stiff hands that no longer moved as easily as they once had. In modern society, such conditions might lead someone to visit a doctor or seek treatment. In medieval life, they were simply part of growing older. Another constant source of pain came from injuries that never fully healed. Small cuts from farm tools, splinters from wooden handles, burns from cooking fires, and bruises from heavy lifting happened almost daily. Because infection was poorly understood, even minor wounds could become swollen and painful for long periods of time. A farmer might continue working with a bandaged hand while the injury slowly healed over weeks. Women experienced another category of pain that medieval society largely treated as ordinary: the physical strain connected to childbirth and household labor. Women carried water from wells, ground grain using heavy stones, and prepared meals over open fires while also raising children. Pregnancy and childbirth occurred frequently, often without trained medical assistance. Labor could last for many exhausting hours, and recovery afterward was rarely gentle, because daily responsibilities returned almost immediately. Beyond physical labor, medieval life also included constant environmental discomfort. Cold winters brought numb fingers and aching joints as people worked outdoors or lived in poorly heated homes. In summer months, farmers endured long days under the sun, leading to exhaustion and burning skin. Weather itself became another source of pain that people simply accepted. Even clothing sometimes caused discomfort. Shoes were often made of stiff leather without cushioning, which meant that walking long distances produced sore feet and blisters. Wool garments protected against cold but could feel heavy and rough against the skin. Armor worn by soldiers during training or battle added even greater strain, pressing weight onto shoulders and hips for hours at a time. Despite all of this, medieval people rarely described themselves as constantly suffering. Pain existed, but it was understood differently than it is today. It was viewed as a normal companion of work, survival, and the human body, rather than something that always required elimination. The medieval world expected resilience. People grew up watching parents and neighbors continue their daily tasks despite aching muscles, damaged teeth, or old injuries. Children learned early that discomfort was simply part of life. And so each morning across medieval Europe, as villages slowly came to life and smoke rose from the first cooking fires, thousands of people stepped into another day carrying the quiet weight of pains that modern life would rarely tolerate. Yet for them, these sensations were simply the ordinary rhythm of survival. As the medieval morning continued and villages slowly filled with the sounds of tools striking wood, animals moving in fields, and carts rolling along dirt roads, another layer of everyday pain revealed itself through the ordinary routines of work. Medieval society depended heavily on physical labor, and this meant that pain was not only expected, but almost built into the structure of daily survival. The body was treated less like something fragile that needed protection, and more like a tool that could be used repeatedly until it wore down. One of the most common sources of discomfort in medieval life came from the hands. Nearly every job required constant use of the fingers and palms. Farmers gripped rough wooden handles of plows, axes, and hoes for hours each day. Blacksmiths hammered hot metal while holding heavy tools that vibrated with every strike. Bakers kneaded thick dough using powerful motions that strained wrists and knuckles. Over time, the skin on the hands hardened into thick calluses. But even with this natural protection, the joints themselves often became swollen and stiff. Many older workers developed fingers that no longer straightened properly after decades of gripping tools. Arthritis slowly formed as cartilage wore down, yet few people considered this unusual. Stiff hands were simply a sign that someone had spent a lifetime working. Feet carried their own constant burden of pain as well. Medieval roads were rarely smooth. Most were uneven dirt paths filled with rocks, mud, or frozen ground during winter months. Walking long distances was common because horses and carts were not available to everyone. Peasants might travel miles to reach fields, markets, or neighboring villages, all while wearing simple leather shoes with thin soles. As a result, blisters, cracked heels, and sore arches were extremely common. During winter, frostbite sometimes threatened those who worked outdoors for long hours in freezing temperatures. In warmer seasons, the opposite problem occurred: swollen feet from walking across hot, dusty roads under the sun. Another form of pain that quietly shaped medieval life came from constant exposure to smoke. Inside homes, the central fire provided warmth and allowed families to cook food, but the smoke rarely escaped perfectly through the roof openings. Over time, the thick air irritated eyes and lungs. Many people developed persistent coughing, burning eyes, and headaches simply from living in smoky environments day after day. For craftsmen working indoors, the problem could become even worse. Blacksmith workshops filled with smoke and heat from the forge. Bakers stood beside blazing ovens for hours. Candle makers, potters, and metal workers often inhaled fumes created by their materials. These conditions slowly damaged the body, yet people rarely connected these symptoms to the environment around them. Even eating could sometimes produce pain. Medieval diets often contained hard bread and coarse grains that required strong chewing. Flour was ground using large stone mills, and tiny fragments of stone sometimes remained in the final product. These small particles slowly wore down teeth over the years. As teeth weakened or cracked, chewing became painful, but most people simply adjusted by eating softer foods or using the stronger side of their mouth. Pain also came from untreated illnesses that modern medicine now manages easily. Minor infections, fevers, and stomach problems could linger for long periods without effective treatment. Herbal remedies existed and sometimes helped, but many conditions simply had to run their course while people continued working as best they could. For example, ear infections might cause sharp throbbing pain for days. Eye infections could make it difficult to see clearly in bright sunlight. Muscle strains from lifting heavy loads might remain sore for weeks, because rest was rarely possible when daily work still needed to be completed. Despite all these difficulties, medieval communities developed a kind of quiet endurance. People rarely stopped their routines because of pain unless the injury was severe enough to prevent movement entirely. Instead, they adjusted their movements, worked more slowly, or relied on family members for assistance while continuing to participate in daily life. This resilience shaped how medieval society understood the human body. Pain was not automatically viewed as a problem needing elimination. Instead, it was seen as a signal that the body had been used heavily, something expected in a world where survival required constant effort. By midday, as fields filled with workers bending over crops and workshops echoed with the sound of tools striking metal or wood, the presence of pain remained almost invisible to an outside observer. Yet beneath the surface of these ordinary scenes, countless aching backs, sore hands, tired feet, and throbbing joints quietly reminded people that life in the medieval world demanded strength from every part of the body. As the medieval day moved deeper into its busiest hours, the full physical cost of everyday survival became even clearer. By late morning and early afternoon, the fields, workshops, and streets of towns were filled with movement. Yet beneath that activity, many people were quietly enduring pains that modern societies would consider severe enough to stop working entirely. In the Middle Ages, however, these sensations were simply woven into the rhythm of life. People did not expect comfort from their bodies, they expected endurance. One of the most widespread and constant forms of suffering came from back pain, which affected nearly every laborer who worked with their hands. Farming in particular required endless bending, lifting, and twisting. A farmer planting seeds might spend hours leaning forward, dropping grains into narrow rows carved into the soil. During harvest season, workers bent low to cut crops with curved sickles, repeating the same motion hundreds or thousands of times in a single day. Carrying bundles of wheat or sacks of grain added even more strain to already tired muscles. Because there were no modern machines to assist with heavy work, nearly every stage of agriculture depended on the strength of the human body. Plowing fields meant pushing or guiding heavy wooden plows, pulled by oxen through dense earth. Gathering firewood required chopping trees and hauling logs across uneven terrain. Water often had to be carried by hand from wells or nearby streams. Each of these tasks placed enormous pressure on the spine, and over the years many workers developed persistent back pain that never truly disappeared. Despite this, stopping work was rarely an option. A poor harvest could mean hunger during the winter months, so farmers pushed through pain simply because survival depended on it. Another source of everyday discomfort came from joint damage caused by repetitive movements. Craftsmen who worked in villages and towns experienced this problem frequently. Blacksmiths lifted heavy hammers repeatedly, striking glowing metal on anvils with powerful downward blows. Carpenters sawed wood for hours, moving their arms back and forth in steady motions that gradually wore down the shoulders and elbows. Weavers sat at looms, guiding threads through complex patterns, sometimes working from early morning until darkness made it impossible to continue. Over time, these repetitive actions slowly damaged joints and tendons. Hands stiffened, elbows ached, and shoulders lost some of their strength. Yet because many crafts were passed down through families, people often spent their entire lives performing the same motions day after day. Pain became a familiar companion rather than an unusual event. For soldiers and warriors, another category of discomfort existed: the strain of training and carrying equipment. Even during peaceful periods, warriors were expected to maintain their strength and skill with weapons. Training with swords, shields, and spears demanded intense physical effort. Shields alone could be heavy, and wearing armor during drills placed enormous weight on the body. Mail armor, made of thousands of interlocking metal rings, might weigh more than 20 kilograms. When worn for long periods, this armor pressed down on shoulders and hips while restricting movement. Bruises, sore muscles, and chafed skin were common results of wearing such equipment during marches or combat training. Pain did not always come from work or training alone. Sometimes it appeared simply from the medical treatments available at the time. Medieval medicine existed in a very different form compared to modern healthcare. Doctors and healers relied heavily on theories about balancing bodily fluids known as humors. One of the common treatments for illness involved bloodletting, where a small cut was made in the skin to allow blood to flow out in the belief that it would restore balance within the body. Although this practice was meant to help patients, it could be uncomfortable or even painful depending on how it was performed. Leeches were sometimes placed on the skin to draw blood slowly, while in other cases small blades were used to open veins. To medieval people, this treatment was normal and widely accepted, even though modern medicine now understands that it rarely improved health. Another painful reality involved untreated bone injuries. Broken fingers, cracked ribs, or sprained ankles often occurred during heavy labor or accidents with tools. Without modern imaging or surgical techniques, treatment usually involved basic splints or bandaging. Healing could take a long time, and bones sometimes set incorrectly, leaving permanent discomfort or reduced movement. Many people therefore carried the marks of old injuries throughout their lives. A crooked finger, a stiff shoulder, or a leg that ached during cold weather might remind someone of an accident that happened years earlier. Perhaps the most striking aspect of medieval pain was how normal it appeared within the community. If someone complained about sore muscles or aching joints, neighbors often understood immediately because they felt the same discomfort themselves. Pain did not isolate people in the same way it sometimes does today. Instead, it formed a shared experience that connected everyone who worked, traveled, and struggled to survive. Villages were full of individuals carrying these invisible burdens. The baker kneading dough early in the morning might have swollen wrists. The shepherd guiding animals across hills might feel constant soreness in his knees. The woman grinding grain at the millstone might experience aching shoulders from pushing the heavy stone in circles hour after hour. Yet life continued around them with steady determination. Markets opened, fields were planted, tools were repaired, and children played in dusty streets. Medieval society did not pause because of pain. It moved forward through it. And so by the middle of the day, while sunlight spread across fields and towns bustled with activity, countless people worked quietly while carrying the persistent aches and strains that modern life would rarely accept. In the medieval world, these pains were not considered unusual at all. They were simply part of being alive. As the long medieval day continued and the sun climbed higher above the fields, another layer of everyday suffering quietly shaped the lives of people across villages and towns. Pain was not only created by labor or injury, it was also deeply connected to the food people ate, the illnesses they carried, and the lack of effective medical care. Many of the aches and discomforts that people experienced were not sudden or dramatic, but slow, persistent sensations that lasted for months or even years. One of the most common and underestimated sources of pain came from hunger and poor nutrition. Medieval diets depended heavily on what local farms could produce. For peasants, this often meant meals built around coarse bread, porridge made from barley or oats, small amounts of vegetables, and occasionally cheese or fish. Meat was less common for many families, and sometimes appeared only during special occasions or successful hunts. Because diets lacked balance, many people suffered from vitamin deficiencies without understanding the cause. These deficiencies created physical symptoms that included weakness, aching bones, swollen joints, and fatigue. Individuals who worked long hours in the fields while eating simple meals sometimes felt constant exhaustion that we might now recognize as the result of poor nutrition. Another painful condition that quietly affected many medieval people was tooth infection spreading into the jaw. When teeth decayed or cracked, bacteria often entered the exposed tissue and created infections that produced intense throbbing pain. Without antibiotics, these infections could last for long periods. Swelling sometimes spread into the face and neck, making it difficult to chew or even speak comfortably. The only reliable solution often involved removing the tooth entirely, which was usually done by a barber surgeon or traveling healer using simple metal tools. The procedure itself was extremely painful because anesthesia, as we know it today, did not exist. People might drink alcohol beforehand to dull the sensation, but the extraction still caused sharp bursts of pain that could echo through the jaw and skull. Yet even after such experiences, many individuals returned quickly to their daily routines because life demanded it. Crops still needed tending, animals required feeding, and markets continued to operate regardless of personal discomfort. Pain also appeared through the constant exposure to weather. Medieval homes provided limited protection against the elements compared to modern buildings. Stone houses in towns and wooden cottages in villages often allowed cold air to enter through gaps in walls or roofs. During winter months, people woke to stiff fingers and aching joints after sleeping in freezing conditions. Working outdoors only intensified this problem. Farmers plowed frozen ground, shepherds watched animals in icy wind, and fishermen handled wet nets while standing on cold shores. Prolonged exposure to cold sometimes caused numbness in fingers and toes, which could later transform into deep aching pain as warmth returned. In summer, the opposite challenge emerged. Long hours under direct sunlight led to sunburn, dehydration, and headaches caused by heat exhaustion. Without modern understanding of hydration or sun protection, many workers pushed through these conditions simply because the tasks of the season could not wait. Another often overlooked form of pain came from skin injuries and infections. Daily work frequently produced cuts, scratches, and blisters. When these wounds became infected, they could swell and throb for days. Even simple activities such as carrying rough wooden tools or walking in stiff leather shoes sometimes created painful sores that took time to heal. Because antiseptics were not available, people relied on herbal remedies, bandages made from cloth, or simple washing with water when possible. Some treatments helped, but others offered only limited relief, while the body slowly healed on its own. Children growing up in medieval communities also experienced their own version of normal pain. Many began helping with chores at young ages, which meant carrying water, gathering firewood, or assisting in fields. Their bodies adapted to physical labor early, but they still experienced sore muscles and tired limbs as they learned the routines of work. Even games played by children sometimes resulted in bruises or scraped knees, because playgrounds were simply open fields, dirt paths, or village streets. Through all of this, medieval people developed a cultural understanding that pain was an expected companion of daily existence. It was not something unusual or alarming unless it became severe enough to stop movement entirely. People spoke about their aches casually, the same way someone today might mention feeling tired after a long day. Villages functioned because everyone continued working despite these discomforts. The baker with aching wrists still prepared bread before sunrise. The farmer with a sore back still walked into the fields carrying tools. The weaver with stiff fingers still guided thread through the loom to produce cloth for clothing and trade. When evening slowly approached and workers began returning home, their bodies carried the marks of the day's effort. Muscles felt heavy, joints moved more slowly, and small injuries reminded them of tasks completed under the sun. Yet in the medieval world, this was not viewed as unusual suffering. It was simply the cost of survival in a time when human strength, endurance, and resilience formed the foundation of everyday life. As the medieval afternoon slowly stretched toward evening, another form of ordinary pain became more visible, one that did not always come from sudden injury or extreme illness, but from the long-term wear placed on the human body by a lifetime of labor. In a society where most people began physical work during childhood and continued it for decades, the body aged quickly. By the time many individuals reached their 30s or 40s, they already carried the marks of years spent lifting, bending, grinding, hammering, and walking across rough landscapes. One of the clearest examples of this slow damage could be seen in the knees and hips of farmers and laborers. Planting crops, harvesting grain, gathering vegetables, and tending animals all required constant squatting, kneeling, and standing again and again throughout the day. These movements placed heavy pressure on joints that were never given the chance to fully recover. Over time, the cartilage within those joints gradually wore away. This created stiffness and aching that we now recognize as forms of arthritis. For many medieval people, however, the condition had no specific name. It was simply understood as the natural price of a hard-working life. Older villagers often moved more slowly, rising carefully from benches or leaning slightly on walking sticks. Yet they continued performing tasks because communities depended on everyone contributing what they could. The same slow damage occurred in the shoulders and arms of people whose work demanded repetitive strength. Mill workers pushed heavy grinding stones to turn grain into flour. Blacksmiths raised hammers hundreds of times a day. Carpenters lifted beams and boards while constructing houses, barns, or fences. Even women performing household duties experienced similar strain from carrying buckets of water, stirring heavy pots over fires, or grinding grain using stone hand mills that required constant circular motion. These repeated actions gradually created deep muscle soreness and joint stiffness that never fully disappeared. Instead, the pain became part of the body's daily rhythm. A person might wake with aching shoulders in the morning, feel them loosen slightly during work, and then experience the same heaviness again by nightfall. Another painful reality came from the tools themselves, which were often crude by modern standards. Wooden handles were rough and sometimes poorly shaped, placing pressure on specific parts of the hand. Metal tools lacked cushioning or shock absorption, meaning that each impact traveled directly through the arms. When a blacksmith struck an anvil or a carpenter drove a nail, the vibration moved through the tool into bones and joints. After years of this constant vibration, many workers developed numbness, tingling, or sharp pains in their hands. Today, such conditions might be treated as nerve injuries or repetitive stress disorders. In the medieval world, they were simply accepted as the inevitable consequences of skilled work. Travel also produced its own form of discomfort. Roads across medieval Europe were rarely smooth. Most were narrow paths of dirt and stone that became muddy during rain and dusty during dry seasons. Merchants, pilgrims, and messengers often traveled for days or weeks on foot. Even those riding horses experienced strain because saddles were basic and journeys were long. Walking such distances created blisters, swollen feet, and aching legs that gradually worsened over time. Travelers sometimes wrapped their feet in cloth beneath their shoes to reduce friction, but pain still accompanied many long journeys. Perhaps one of the most difficult forms of pain came from old injuries that never healed correctly. A broken finger set without proper alignment, a twisted ankle that was never allowed enough rest, or a deep cut that left scar tissue could continue causing discomfort for the rest of a person's life. Without modern surgery or rehabilitation, the body simply adapted as best it could. Many medieval skeletons discovered by archaeologists show signs of bones that healed unevenly after fractures. These individuals survived their injuries and continued living, but they likely carried lasting pain every day. Even eyesight sometimes became a source of discomfort. Craftsmen working with fine detail, such as scribes copying manuscripts or jewelers shaping small pieces of metal, often strained their eyes in dim light. Candles and oil lamps provided limited illumination, forcing people to focus intensely on their work. This could lead to headaches and eye fatigue, especially during long winter evenings when darkness arrived early. Despite all these challenges, medieval communities developed ways to endure pain together. Family members helped one another with heavy tasks when someone's body felt especially tired. Elders shared knowledge about herbal remedies that might ease sore muscles or reduce swelling. Simple treatments such as warm compresses, herbal salves, or resting near the fire sometimes provided small moments of relief. These solutions were rarely perfect, but they allowed people to continue moving forward through life's difficulties. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon and the long day of work finally approached its end, the presence of pain did not disappear. Instead, it followed people home. Workers returned to cottages and longhouses with tired limbs and aching backs. sitting near the fire while slowly unwinding from the physical strain of the day. For medieval people, this quiet exhaustion was not seen as unusual suffering. It was simply the familiar feeling that came after another day spent surviving in a demanding world, where strength, patience, and endurance were required from every part of the human body. As the medieval evening slowly settled over villages and towns, another kind of pain quietly revealed itself. One that did not come from sudden accidents or heavy tools, but from the slow exhaustion that followed an entire day of physical effort. When workers finally returned home from fields, workshops, or roads, their bodies often carried the accumulated strain of many hours of labor. Muscles felt heavy, joints moved more stiffly, and small injuries that had been ignored during work now made themselves more noticeable. Even simple actions in the evening could remind someone of the physical toll the day had taken. Sitting down after hours of standing sometimes caused a dull ache to spread through the knees and lower back. Removing shoes might reveal swollen feet or blisters formed from walking across rough ground. Hands that had gripped tools all day often felt tight and sore, the fingers reluctant to fully straighten after repeated use. Yet the evening routine itself did not allow complete rest. Medieval households remained busy even after the main work of the day ended. Fires needed to be maintained, food prepared, and animals checked before night fully arrived. These final tasks meant that people continued moving despite their fatigue, carrying their aches quietly through the last hours before sleep. Inside homes, the central hearth became the focus of evening life. Families gathered around the fire to cook meals, warm their hands, and share news from the day. The warmth of the flames sometimes helped ease stiff muscles that had been exposed to cold wind or damp weather during outdoor work. People stretched their legs closer to the heat or rubbed their hands together slowly to restore feeling in fingers that had grown numb. Although medieval communities lacked modern medicine, they still possessed simple traditions for easing everyday pain. Many families kept small knowledge of herbal remedies passed down through generations. Plants such as willow bark were sometimes used to reduce aches and fever, while other herbs were mixed into salves to soothe sore joints or irritated skin. Warm cloths soaked in herbal infusions might be placed over swollen areas to provide comfort. These treatments rarely removed pain completely, but they offered small moments of relief that helped people recover enough to face another day of work. Another common evening habit involved gentle stretching and movement. Workers often shifted their bodies slowly while sitting near the fire, rolling shoulders or extending legs to reduce stiffness built up during the day. Although they did not describe these movements using modern medical terms, they instinctively understood that the body needed time to loosen after long hours of strain. Older members of the household sometimes felt these aches more deeply than younger workers. Years of labor gradually left their marks on the body. A farmer who had spent decades plowing fields might feel persistent soreness in his lower back. A woman who had carried water and ground grain for most of her life might experience aching shoulders each evening. Yet these elders rarely withdrew completely from work. Instead, they shifted toward lighter tasks that allowed them to continue contributing to the household. They might repair tools, mend clothing, or watch over children while younger family members handled heavier labor. Another quiet form of pain came from the emotional weight of daily hardship. Medieval life involved constant uncertainty. Harvests could fail, storms might destroy crops, and illness sometimes struck without warning. The stress created by these worries did not always appear as visible injury, but it could manifest as headaches, tension in the body, or restless sleep at night. People did not separate emotional strain from physical discomfort the way modern medicine often does. Instead, both experiences blended together as part of the same human struggle to survive. Despite these hardships, medieval evenings also carried moments of calm that helped people endure their pain. Storytelling around the fire, quiet conversation between family members, and the simple comfort of warmth after a long, cold day provided a sense of peace that softened the edges of physical discomfort. Gradually, the sounds of the village faded as darkness deepened. Workers finished their final tasks and prepared for sleep. Straw bedding or simple wooden benches offered rest after the long day, and tired bodies slowly relaxed as the fire burned lower in the hearth. By the time night fully arrived, most people were already drifting into sleep while carrying the same aches they had known for years. Yet in the medieval world, this was not considered unusual suffering. It was simply the familiar condition of life in a time when survival depended on strength, patience, and the ability to endure pain as an ordinary companion of daily existence. As the night deepened and most of the village finally settled into darkness, the body began another quiet confrontation with pain that medieval people understood all too well. When workers lay down on straw bedding, wooden benches, or rough mattresses filled with dried grasses, their muscles finally had the chance to rest after the long hours of the day. Yet rest did not always mean comfort. For many people, the stillness of night actually made certain aches more noticeable than they had been during the busy hours of work. One of the most common nighttime discomforts came from stiff muscles slowly cooling after physical labor. During the day, movement kept blood flowing through the body, allowing tired muscles to continue working despite strain. But once a person stopped moving and lay still in the quiet darkness, those same muscles sometimes tightened. The lower back, shoulders, and legs could throb gently as the body began its slow recovery. Without soft mattresses or supportive bedding, sleeping positions also contributed to pain. Medieval beds were simple structures. Some consisted of wooden frames filled with straw or dried reeds, while poorer households sometimes slept directly on padded benches along the walls of a house. Over time, the straw flattened, creating uneven surfaces that pressed against the hips, shoulders, or spine during sleep. People shifted positions frequently during the night, adjusting blankets or furs while searching for comfort. Yet this restless movement was normal and expected. Few medieval individuals expected perfect sleep. Instead, they understood that rest came gradually between moments of shifting and waking. Another quiet source of discomfort came from the lingering effects of untreated illnesses. A person suffering from fever might lie awake sweating beneath heavy blankets while the fire crackled nearby. Someone with joint pain from arthritis might feel sharp stiffness in the knees when turning from one side to the other. Individuals with breathing problems sometimes coughed during the night, because smoke from the household hearth lingered in the air long after cooking fires had been lit earlier in the evening. Yet even these symptoms were rarely seen as unusual crises unless they became severe enough to threaten life. Most people simply endured them, trusting that the body would recover with time or that herbal remedies might ease the discomfort. For women, nighttime sometimes carried another form of pain connected to pregnancy and childbirth recovery. Childbirth was extremely common in medieval communities, and mothers often returned to daily responsibilities very quickly after giving birth. During the weeks following childbirth, many women experienced soreness, exhaustion, and physical weakness while still caring for infants and managing household work. The lack of long recovery periods meant that this pain blended quietly into ordinary life. Mothers rested when they could, often with infants sleeping beside them, but the responsibilities of family life continued regardless of physical discomfort. Another type of pain that occasionally appeared during the night was toothache, which medieval people knew all too well. Dental infections sometimes created deep throbbing sensations that became worse when lying down because blood pressure increased in the head. Individuals suffering from these conditions might wake repeatedly throughout the night as the ache pulsed through the jaw. Some people attempted to relieve the pain by placing herbal mixtures against the tooth or rinsing their mouth with warm liquids. These remedies sometimes reduced the sensation slightly, but complete relief was rare until the damaged tooth was eventually removed. Despite these discomforts, night also offered something valuable: the body's slow process of healing. While sleep was not always perfect, the quiet hours allowed muscles to recover from strain and wounds to begin closing. Small injuries gained strength during these moments of rest, preparing the body to face another demanding day. In this way, medieval people developed a deep familiarity with their physical limits. They understood that pain came and went with the rhythm of work, weather, illness, and age. Some nights were more comfortable than others, but discomfort itself was not considered unusual enough to interrupt the flow of life. As the fire burned lower and the village lay silent beneath the dark sky, countless individuals slept while carrying the same quiet aches that had followed them through the years. Yet in the medieval world, these sensations were simply part of being human. A reminder that survival required endurance, patience, and the ability to rise again each morning, despite the lingering weight of yesterday's pain. As another morning slowly returned to the medieval village and the first gray light of dawn began to creep across fields and rooftops, the cycle of ordinary pain quietly began again. Medieval people did not wake into comfort. They woke into bodies that carried the memory of every task performed the day before. The aches of yesterday did not disappear overnight. Instead, they simply softened enough during sleep to allow the body to rise again and begin working once more. For many individuals, the first moments after waking were the most uncomfortable. Muscles that had stiffened during the night needed time to loosen again. People stretched slowly, rolled their shoulders, or rubbed their knees before standing. A farmer rising from a straw mattress might feel a sharp stiffness in his lower back as he stood upright for the first time that morning. A craftsman might flex his fingers repeatedly to bring life back into hands that had grown stiff during the cold night. This early discomfort was so common that it became almost invisible within medieval society. Everyone experienced it, so no one considered it unusual. One of the most persistent sources of pain throughout life was chronic joint wear, something that archaeologists have discovered frequently when studying medieval skeletons. The bones of people who lived during this time often show clear signs of arthritis, worn joints, and stress fractures caused by years of intense labor. Knees appear flattened from constant pressure. Vertebrae in the spine show compression from lifting heavy loads, and shoulders display damage from repeated motion. These skeletal clues tell us something important. Medieval people did not simply experience occasional pain. Many of them lived with constant background discomfort that followed them throughout adulthood. And yet life continued normally around these conditions. A farmer with aching knees still walked behind the plow. A woman with sore shoulders still carried water from the well. A blacksmith with swollen hands still lifted his hammer to shape iron tools needed by the entire community. Another surprisingly common source of pain came from infected wounds and skin conditions. Daily life involved constant contact with rough surfaces, sharp tools, and dirty environments. Small cuts or splinters often became inflamed. Without antibiotics or antiseptics, these wounds sometimes remained sore for days or even weeks. Farm animals added another risk. A scratch from a sheep's horn or a bite from a frightened dog could easily become infected if not cleaned properly. Medieval healers sometimes used herbal poultices or cloth bandages to cover wounds, but healing depended largely on the body's own strength. People therefore became accustomed to carrying minor injuries while continuing their daily routines. A bandaged hand, a wrapped arm, or a limp from a twisted ankle might appear in any village without attracting much attention. Even simple illnesses created ongoing discomfort that many people accepted as normal. Fevers caused headaches and aching limbs. Stomach illnesses produced cramps that made eating difficult. Respiratory infections created persistent coughing that could last through entire seasons. Because medical knowledge was limited, people often relied on patience while the body recovered naturally. During this time, they continued participating in work whenever possible, resting only when illness became too severe to ignore. Children growing up in medieval communities learned about pain very early in life. Helping with chores meant carrying wood, tending animals, or assisting with harvest tasks. Their young bodies sometimes experienced sore muscles or minor injuries as they adapted to these responsibilities. But childhood also included resilience. Children watched adults endure discomfort without complaint, and this shaped their understanding of strength and endurance. Pain was not viewed as something shocking or unusual. It was simply part of growing up in a world where survival depended on hard work. Another layer of discomfort came from the environment itself, which medieval people could not easily control. Long winters created stiff joints and numb fingers. Rain soaked clothing and caused chills that lingered in the body for hours. Summer heat led to exhaustion and dehydration during long days of field work. Yet these environmental pains blended naturally into everyday life. People prepared for them as best they could with clothing, fire, and shelter. But complete comfort was never the goal. Survival was. By the time the medieval day was fully underway once again, the presence of pain had already returned quietly into countless lives. Farmers bent over fields with sore backs. Craftsmen gripped tools despite aching hands. Travelers walked dusty roads with tired legs and blistered feet. And still the world moved forward around them. Markets opened. Bells rang from churches. Children ran through village streets, smoke rose from cooking fires. Pain existed everywhere within this world, yet it rarely stopped the rhythm of life. Instead, it simply flowed alongside it, a quiet and constant companion to every task, every season, and every generation living through the demanding reality of medieval daily life. As the medieval day stretched deeper into the afternoon and the rhythm of work continued without pause, another form of pain quietly shaped the lives of people across Europe and beyond. The pain that came simply from aging in a world built entirely on physical labor. Unlike modern societies where machines carry much of the physical burden, medieval communities relied almost entirely on human strength. This meant that every year of life slowly carved its mark into the body. By the time many medieval people reached their 40s, they were often already considered old by the standards of their communities. This was not only because life expectancy was shorter, but because the body itself had already endured decades of demanding work. Bones had been compressed by heavy lifting, Joints had worn down from endless motion, and muscles had carried loads that modern workers rarely experience today. One of the clearest signs of this aging process was chronic back pain, which was nearly universal among those who worked in agriculture. Farmers spent thousands of hours bending toward the ground, planting seeds, pulling weeds, harvesting crops, or repairing fences. The spine, which was never designed to handle such continuous strain without rest, gradually began to show signs of damage. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons reveal that many farmers had compressed vertebrae and visible degeneration in their lower backs. These injuries were not sudden accidents. They were the result of years spent carrying sacks of grain, bundles of wood, or buckets of water. Yet despite this damage, farmers continued working because there was no alternative. Fields still needed tending, and animals still required care. For craftsmen and artisans, the aging body produced a different pattern of pain. A blacksmith, for example, might begin his career as a strong young apprentice, capable of lifting heavy tools and striking iron with powerful blows. But after 20 or 30 years of hammering metal on an anvil, the repetitive shock traveling through his arms often created deep soreness in the elbows and shoulders. The joints gradually stiffened, and the once effortless motion of swinging a hammer became slower and heavier. Carpenters experienced similar problems. Their hands, which had spent decades gripping saws and chisels, sometimes developed swollen knuckles and reduced flexibility. Fingers that had once moved quickly across tools became stiff and painful during cold weather. Yet these craftsmen continued their work because their skills were essential to their communities. Even simple walking, something modern people rarely think about, created long-term discomfort in medieval life. Roads were uneven and footwear offered little support. Shoes were typically made from leather without cushioning, and long journeys often involved walking across stones, mud, or hard-packed earth. Over many years, this constant pressure caused pain in the feet, ankles, and knees. Travelers, merchants, and messengers who spent large portions of their lives moving between towns often carried permanent injuries in their legs. Some developed limps from untreated sprains or fractures that healed incorrectly. Others suffered from swollen joints that worsened during cold or damp weather. Another quiet but widespread source of pain came from untreated infections within the body. Minor wounds could become inflamed, but internal infections were even more troubling because people often did not understand their cause. An infected tooth could send pain shooting through the jaw for weeks. A deep cut that became infected might swell and throb long after the initial injury had occurred. In many cases, the body eventually overcame these infections on its own. But during that time, the individual continued working despite discomfort. Pain did not pause daily responsibilities. It simply traveled alongside them. Women in medieval societies also experienced a unique form of long-term physical strain connected to childbirth and household labor. Many women gave birth multiple times throughout their lives, often while continuing to manage cooking, cleaning, water carrying, and textile production. Each pregnancy placed stress on the body, and recovery periods were often short because household responsibilities remained constant. As years passed, some women experienced lasting pain in their backs or hips as a result of these repeated physical demands. Yet, like the men working in fields or workshops, they continued fulfilling their roles within the household and community. What makes medieval pain especially striking is that it rarely stood alone as a dramatic event. Instead, it blended quietly into everyday life. people did not pause their routines every time their bodies hurt, because pain was expected. It was part of the natural cost of living in a world where survival required strength, endurance, and constant effort. Villages were therefore full of individuals carrying these quiet burdens. The farmer walking toward his fields might feel a dull ache in his spine from years of lifting. The baker kneading dough before sunrise might notice stiffness in her wrists from decades of grinding grain. The shepherd guiding animals across hills might feel soreness in his knees with every step. Yet despite these aches, life continued moving forward with remarkable determination. Children ran through fields. Traders opened market stalls. Bells rang from church towers marking the passage of time. Smoke rose from hearth fires as meals were prepared. Pain existed everywhere in this world, but it rarely stopped people from living their lives. Instead, it became something almost invisible, a constant background presence that shaped how bodies moved, how people rested, and how communities understood the effort required simply to survive. In this way, medieval society developed a powerful cultural expectation. Life would hurt, and yet life must continue anyway. Strength was not measured by the absence of pain, but by the ability to carry it quietly while still rising each morning to work, travel, and build the world around them. As the medieval world moved through its long centuries, the experience of pain remained deeply woven into nearly every corner of daily life. By now it becomes clear that pain in the Middle Ages was not limited to work injuries, illness, or aging. It also appeared in the ordinary routines of discipline, religion, and social customs, areas where modern people might never expect discomfort to be considered normal. One important place where pain appeared regularly was within religious life. Medieval society was strongly shaped by religious belief, and many people believed that physical suffering had spiritual meaning. Pain was sometimes seen as a reminder of human weakness or a way of sharing in the suffering described in religious stories. Because of this belief, certain acts of self-discipline involved discomfort that today might seem surprising. Some individuals practiced forms of fasting that left them weak or dizzy for long periods. Others slept on hard surfaces or wore rough garments made from coarse fibers that irritated the skin. These actions were not meant as punishment, but as ways to strengthen the spirit by resisting physical comfort. In this environment, pain could even be interpreted as something meaningful, rather than something that must always be avoided. Another unexpected source of ordinary pain came from legal punishments and public discipline, which were common parts of medieval justice. Minor crimes sometimes resulted in punishments such as standing in public stocks or receiving lashes from a whip. While these events were meant to enforce order in the community, they also meant that many people witnessed or experienced physical punishment during their lives. Yet even here, the medieval understanding of pain remained different from modern attitudes. Such punishments were viewed as necessary parts of maintaining social balance, rather than acts of cruelty meant purely to cause suffering. Communities believed that visible discipline reminded others to respect laws and traditions. Pain also appeared in education and apprenticeship, particularly for young people learning trades. Apprentices working under master craftsmen often performed physically demanding tasks as part of their training. A young blacksmith's apprentice might spend long days pumping bellows, carrying heavy iron bars, or assisting with hammering work at the forge. A carpenter's apprentice might lift timber or saw wood for hours while learning the skills of the trade. These activities built strength and discipline, but also produced sore muscles, blistered hands, and tired limbs. Yet apprentices accepted these discomforts because they represented the path toward becoming skilled craftsmen capable of supporting themselves in adulthood. Even clothing and fashion sometimes created pain in medieval life. Shoes, belts, and armor were made from thick leather or metal and could press heavily against the body during long periods of wear. Soldiers wearing chainmail or plate armor experienced pressure across the shoulders and chest while marching or training. Although armor protected them during combat, wearing it for extended time could cause bruising and fatigue. Women's clothing occasionally included tight garments or heavy layered fabrics that restricted movement during daily tasks. While these garments served practical purposes such as warmth or modesty, they also added to the physical strain experienced during work. Another form of everyday discomfort came from medical treatments themselves. Medieval medicine was based on theories about balancing bodily fluids known as humors. Treatments sometimes involved procedures that were uncomfortable, but widely accepted as helpful. Bloodletting was one example. A healer might open a small vein to release blood in the belief that it would restore balance within the body. In other cases, leeches were placed on the skin to draw blood slowly. While these treatments sometimes relieved certain conditions, they could also cause pain or weakness afterward. Herbal remedies, poultices, and compresses were also common. Some of these treatments helped reduce inflammation or soothe sore muscles, while others had little effect. But the important point is that people accepted these methods as part of normal health care, even when the treatments themselves were uncomfortable. Despite all these different forms of pain, medieval communities developed a remarkable cultural resilience. Pain was rarely treated as a personal crisis, unless it became severe enough to threaten survival. Instead, discomfort was understood as a natural element of life's journey. Families helped one another manage injuries. Neighbors shared herbal knowledge. Elders offered advice about how to endure long days of labor or recover from illness. This shared understanding created a sense of solidarity within communities where everyone knew that the human body would eventually feel the weight of time and effort. When evening arrived and people once again gathered near hearth fires, the aches of the day slowly settled into tired muscles and worn joints. Yet within those quiet moments, there was also a sense of accomplishment. Work had been completed, food prepared, and another day survived. In the medieval world, pain did not always signal failure or weakness. Instead, it often served as a quiet reminder of effort, endurance, and survival, proof that the body had been used in the hard but necessary work of sustaining life. As we move deeper into understanding medieval life, another quiet truth emerges about pain in that world. People did not simply endure physical suffering because they had no choice. They also learned to understand pain as part of the natural rhythm of existence. From childhood to old age, the body was expected to work hard, grow tired, recover, and then begin again. Pain was not always dramatic or terrifying. Much of the time, it existed as a dull background presence that people carried with them through ordinary routines. One place where this became especially visible was in the world of agriculture, which formed the backbone of medieval society. Farming was not only difficult during harvest season, it demanded physical effort during every part of the year. In spring, the land had to be plowed and planted. In summer, weeds had to be removed and crops protected. Autumn brought the exhausting work of harvesting and storing food. Winter required repairing tools, chopping firewood, and caring for animals in freezing conditions. Each season produced its own particular strains on the body. During planting, farmers spent long hours bending toward the soil, causing soreness in the lower back and legs. Harvest season required cutting grain with sickles, a motion repeated thousands of times that strained wrists and shoulders. Even tending animals involved lifting heavy feed, carrying water buckets, and walking long distances across fields. Because this work repeated year after year, many farmers developed chronic aches that became part of daily life. A man in his 40s might feel a constant heaviness in his knees. A woman responsible for grinding grain might notice persistent soreness in her shoulders. These sensations were not treated as unusual illness. Instead, they were accepted as evidence that someone had spent a lifetime working. Another place where everyday pain appeared was in the kitchens and workshops of medieval homes. Food preparation alone required enormous physical effort. Grain had to be ground into flour using heavy stone mills that demanded constant pushing and turning. Dough needed kneading by hand, sometimes for long periods, to produce bread for large families. Cooking over open fires exposed people to heat, smoke, and occasional burns. These kitchen tasks were repeated every day, meaning that the people performing them often experienced sore wrists, tired arms, and aching backs. Yet meals still had to be prepared regardless of discomfort, because food was essential for survival. In workshops, the situation was similar. Leather workers pulled and stretched thick animal hides. Potters shaped clay using steady pressure from their hands. Weavers operated looms that required repetitive movements throughout the day. These tasks slowly wore down muscles and joints over time. Another subtle but powerful form of pain came from the long-term effects of illness that never fully disappeared. Infections sometimes left lasting weakness in the body even after the worst symptoms passed. A person who had once suffered from severe fever might continue feeling fatigue months later. Someone who had recovered from a deep wound might carry stiffness in that area for years. Without modern medical understanding, people often describe these lingering effects simply as the body becoming weaker with age. They continued living and working while adapting to the limitations created by earlier illnesses. Pain also appeared through the unpredictable accidents of everyday life. Working with tools always carried risk. A slip of a knife could cut a finger. A falling branch might bruise a shoulder. A horse could kick unexpectedly while being saddled. These accidents were not rare events, they were constant possibilities in a world filled with physical labor. Most of the time, injuries were minor enough that people continued working while the body healed naturally. A bandage wrapped around a hand or a cloth tied around a bruised limb became a familiar sight in villages and towns. Despite the constant presence of discomfort, medieval communities did not see themselves as living miserable lives. Pain was balanced by moments of rest, family gatherings, shared meals, and celebrations that marked the passing of seasons. Festivals, markets, and religious holidays offered brief periods when work paused and people could relax together. These moments of relief reminded individuals that life was more than labor and endurance. Yet even during celebrations, the physical marks of daily work remained visible in tired muscles and weathered hands. What truly defined medieval attitudes toward pain was their acceptance of it as a natural companion to life's responsibilities. Instead of seeking to eliminate every discomfort, people focused on continuing their duties while managing the aches that came with them. When night returned and villages once again grew quiet beneath the stars, the same tired bodies settled down to rest. Some joints throbbed gently. Muscles slowly relaxed after the long day. Yet sleep eventually arrived, allowing the body to recover just enough to rise again when morning light touched the horizon. And so the cycle continued. Work, strain, recovery, and work again, a rhythm that defined daily life across the medieval world for countless generations. As we move further into the everyday reality of medieval life, it becomes clear that pain was not only connected to work, injury, or illness. It was also deeply tied to the environment people lived in, an environment that could be harsh, unpredictable, and physically demanding. Medieval communities did not have the protective comforts of modern housing, medicine, or technology, which meant that the natural world itself often became a quiet source of daily discomfort. Cold weather was one of the most powerful forces shaping medieval pain. Winters across much of Europe were long and severe, and houses offered only limited protection against freezing temperatures. Many homes were built from wood, stone, or mud, with small windows and simple roofs that allowed cold air to enter easily. The central hearth provided warmth, but it rarely heated the entire building evenly. As a result, people often woke in the morning with stiff fingers, aching joints, and numb toes after sleeping through cold nights. Farmers who stepped outside before sunrise felt the biting air immediately in their lungs and hands. Even simple tasks like milking cows, carrying water, or chopping wood could become painful when performed in freezing conditions. Prolonged exposure to cold sometimes caused deeper problems as well. Fingers could crack from dry winter air, creating painful splits in the skin that took time to heal. In extreme cases, frostbite threatened those who spent too long outdoors without proper protection. Yet winter work could not simply stop. Animals still needed care, firewood still needed to be gathered, and families depended on these tasks for survival. Summer brought a completely different set of physical challenges. Long hours working under the sun often produced heat exhaustion, dehydration, and burning skin. Fields offered little shade during harvest season, and workers sometimes spent entire days exposed to direct sunlight while cutting crops or stacking bundles of grain. Without modern understanding of hydration, people sometimes ignored early signs of heat exhaustion. Headaches, dizziness, and aching limbs were treated as ordinary consequences of hard work, rather than warning signals. Farmers rested briefly when possible, drinking water or ale before returning to the fields. Rain and damp weather created their own form of discomfort. Wet clothing clung to the body during long hours outdoors, and many people worked through storms because crops could not wait for perfect weather. Dampness sometimes caused aching joints, especially among older individuals whose bodies had already endured years of physical strain. Another environmental factor that quietly produced pain was constant exposure to rough surfaces and natural materials. Tools were made from wood and iron, roads from stone and dirt, and houses from materials that were practical but rarely comfortable. Splinters from wooden handles, scratches from rough surfaces, and bruises from hard ground were common parts of daily life. Even sleeping arrangements reflected this environment. Beds filled with straw provided basic cushioning but gradually flattened over time, forcing people to sleep on uneven surfaces. While this bedding offered warmth, it rarely supported the body perfectly. Many individuals woke during the night to shift their position as pressure built in the hips, shoulders, or lower back. Beyond physical discomfort, medieval life also included the pain caused by sudden outbreaks of disease, which periodically swept through towns and villages. Illnesses such as fevers, infections, and epidemics appeared without warning, and spread quickly among populations with limited medical protection. During these times, people experienced severe symptoms, aching limbs, burning fevers, headaches, and weakness. Yet even during outbreaks, many individuals continued working until their bodies could no longer manage the strain. Communities often had no choice but to carry on, because survival depended on maintaining food supplies and daily routines. Despite these harsh realities, medieval people developed remarkable endurance. Their understanding of pain was shaped by the belief that discomfort was an inevitable part of existence. Rather than expecting life to be free from suffering, they focused on adapting to it. Neighbors helped one another during difficult seasons. Families shared knowledge about herbs that might ease sore muscles or reduce swelling. Elders passed down practical advice about surviving harsh winters or recovering from illness. These shared experiences created strong communities built on cooperation and resilience. Everyone understood that the body would eventually feel the weight of hard work, cold nights, illness, and age. Yet life continued with determination. Children still played in village streets. Farmers still planted crops each spring. Craftsmen still shaped tools and built homes that would shelter future generations. Pain existed everywhere in this world, but it did not stop life from moving forward. Instead, it became one more thread woven into the complex fabric of medieval daily existence, a constant reminder that survival required strength, patience, and the ability to rise each day ready to face whatever challenges the world might bring. As we reach the final stretch of this quiet journey through medieval life, one final truth about pain becomes clear. People in that world did not measure their lives by how much discomfort they could avoid. Instead, they measured life by how well they could continue despite it. Pain was woven into the background of ordinary existence so deeply that many people barely spoke about it. It was simply understood. For most individuals in medieval society, the body itself slowly became a record of lived experience. Years of farm work, hardened hands, and bent backs. Walking long distances across rough roads toughened the feet, but also wore down joints. Repeated lifting of heavy load shaped muscles while gradually creating aches that never fully disappeared. Each scar, bruise, or stiff movement told a story about the life someone had lived. By the time many people reached middle age, their bodies carried the quiet consequences of decades of labor. A farmer might wake each morning feeling stiffness in the spine before stepping outside to begin work again. A blacksmith might notice a permanent heaviness in his shoulders from years of swinging heavy hammers. A woman who had spent years grinding grain, carrying water, and tending fires might feel constant soreness in her wrists and arms. Yet these sensations rarely stopped daily activity. Medieval culture valued endurance. The ability to keep moving forward despite discomfort was seen not as extraordinary strength but simply as part of responsible adulthood. Everyone understood that life demanded effort, and effort inevitably produced pain. Even the elderly, whose bodies carried the greatest burden of years, continued participating in daily routines whenever possible. Older men might help repair tools, guide younger workers, or care for animals that required less strenuous effort. Older women often prepared food, supervised children, or passed down knowledge about herbs, cooking, and household skills. Though their movements were slower and their joints sometimes stiff, they remained active members of their communities. Another important element shaping medieval attitudes toward pain was religious belief. For many people, suffering held spiritual meaning. Christian teachings often described hardship as a test of faith or a reminder of human humility. Experiencing discomfort did not necessarily signal failure or misfortune. Instead, it could be interpreted as part of a larger divine order. Because of this perspective, individuals sometimes endured pain with remarkable patience. Illness, injury, and exhaustion were accepted as temporary trials rather than events that defined a person's entire life. Communities gathered in churches, prayed together, and supported one another during difficult times. This spiritual framework did not remove physical suffering, but it helped many people understand it in a way that allowed them to continue living with dignity and hope. At the same time, medieval communities also understood the importance of moments of relief. Even in a world filled with labor and hardship, there were pauses when pain briefly faded into the background. After a long harvest day, workers might sit together sharing food and conversation as the sun set over the fields. During winter evenings, families gathered around warm fires, telling stories while muscles slowly relaxed after the day's work. Festivals and seasonal celebrations brought music, dancing, and laughter into villages that otherwise lived according to demanding routines. For a few hours, people forgot the aches of their bodies and enjoyed the presence of neighbors and friends. These moments reminded medieval communities that life was not defined only by struggle. It also contained warmth, companionship, and quiet satisfaction. When we look back at this world today, it may seem unimaginable to accept so much physical discomfort as ordinary. Modern medicine, technology, and comfort have transformed how people experience daily life. Many pains that medieval individuals considered unavoidable can now be prevented or treated quickly. Yet the resilience of those earlier generations remains remarkable. Without modern tools or knowledge, they built farms, towns, roads, churches, and entire civilizations while living with the constant presence of physical strain. They planted crops in frozen soil, walked miles across rough landscapes, lifted heavy loads, endured illness, and still found ways to raise families, celebrate holidays, and create communities that lasted for centuries. The medieval world was not simply a place of suffering. It was a world of endurance, a society where pain existed, but life continued forward through determination, cooperation, and resilience. And as the sun slowly sets over the distant fields of that long-past era, the quiet villages grow still. Fires flicker inside wooden homes. Tired bodies finally rest after another demanding day. Outside, the night air settles over the land just as it has for thousands of years. The people of that world sleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same familiar rhythm: work, effort, strain, and survival. A rhythm that shaped an entire age of human history. If you enjoyed traveling through this slow, deep look into forgotten history, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into the strange, quiet realities of the past. Because history is full of stories that seem unbelievable today, yet for the people who lived them, it was simply daily life.